Experiencer and author Ben Carraud will take us on his personal journey of remembering Eugen Kunstmann, Obert's SS, and coming to terms with, as well as learning valuable lessons from that previous life. Benjamin will also share his experiences of the intermission period before this incarnation. As he says so eloquently in his book, Goodbye, Fields of Prokhorovka, there are moments in life, fleeting and inexplicable, when the thin veil of reality seems to blur, and the past bleeds into the present, weaving its threads into the fabric of our daily lives. It happens in the strangest of ways. It's the resonance of something entirely new, the joy coming from a piece fitting so perfectly into a space you didn't even know existed within you.
All right, well, thank you very much, Carol, for this wonderful introduction. I hope I will live up to your expectations. I would like, first of all, to thank you and everyone who helped organize this symposium. I don't really have that many chances in my life to tell this very strange and deep story that I experienced. If I may start from the beginning, first of all, there was two phases in my story. I think the one started when I was really young, and then a little bit later, when I was between the ages of 24 and 27, that was the core of when I experienced my story. Before I begin, if you don't mind, I would like to go back to the start and give you a little bit more information about who I am as a person. So that will give you some perspective on how I experienced the story, because I intend this talk to be an exploration. You will have throughout the day the voice of experts, people who have studied the experience of reincarnation from the perspective of researchers or therapists. And I'm glad I have the chance before that happens to give you the perspective from somebody who goes through that kind of experience, because it happens around us. And I've been gifted, at first I thought I was plagued, but I've been gifted the chance to experience the very deep story that I was able to research. So I was born in France in 1991. That makes me 34 today. And I was born as a dual citizen. So my mother is English and my father is French, but I was raised in the French countryside, not very far away from where I am at the moment. As a child, I was going through a lot of very traumatic nightmares. For some reason, most of them stopped when I turned about probably 7. Some of them slept through a little bit longer and kept haunting me throughout my teenage years, which is why some of them I remember. Dreams of being trapped, and also dreams of witnessing awful torture on other people. So things I wasn't doing myself, but I was witnessing and being powerless to stop. The story reached a different point in my case when I was about 24, and I was at the time living in China. So I'm somebody who has traveled a lot. I've always felt extremely comfortable living pretty much everywhere. And at the time I was living in China for about a year. I had been going through a rough winter. I remember it was very polluted. I was far away from my family. And when you go in such a different place, you live in a fantasy world for a bit until reality catches back. And all of a sudden you're facing with the difficulties of everyday life. And I was really waiting for spring to come. And of course, with days getting longer and the sunshine and the warmth being back, I thought it was going to solve the inner turmoil I was facing, but that wasn't to be the case, because as I was going through that experience of being far away and from everything I knew, I started to experience something different. I started to have what I call now flashbacks. So not in the form of nightmares this time, I was fully awake. And this is when I was experiencing these strange flashbacks. So I would like to give you a very precise retelling of how the very big first flashback happened to me. I was working to work. It was a sunny day in the morning, and I remember I was walking past some very Soviet-looking buildings. And all of a sudden, I was taken from that reality to a completely different one instantly without even realizing what was going on, because all of a sudden I was in a city that was destroyed. I could see rubble on the ground. I could see all the windows being smashed. I could hear gunfire in the distance. Strangely enough, I could hear artillery fire whizzing above my head, quite far up. But for some reason, and I've never been in the army in this lifetime, but I already knew that these weren't they were not posing any danger to me. I knew they were coming from my own lines, completely instinctively. And beyond the visual and the audio senses that I was having, it was the emotions that I was feeling that was very strong. I knew there was men around me. I knew I was leading them. I knew I was in danger. I knew that at any moment there could be somebody high up in those windows who could poke a rifle and take a shot, or drop some explosive, drop a grenade. It was just a very, very, very intense flashback that I went through. And as quickly as it came, it just vanished. So obviously I was absolutely terrorized. I had no idea what happened. It was so vivid that it stuck with me for a few days. And my immediate response to that was, I think I've pushed my resistance a bit too far, and now my sanity is being challenged, if I may say. And now I experienced a different kind of terror, the terror that I was losing my mind. I had several similar flashbacks, not always the same setting. Sometimes I was just aboard a armored vehicle roaming through some fields, or I was in a room full of other people and we were planning some attacks. I remember watching over some probably aerial pictures taken from the air of an area and just poring over all the details that we could see below us. And I had no idea what to do with it, because to give you some more background about myself, I had never heard of any similar stories before. I was aware of the word reincarnation, but as a very distant Eastern belief. I had heard a few times in my life some stories I dismissed as, wild stories of people claiming they were former pharaohs in their previous lives, or that there were knights, or that there were nobles who had got their head chopped off during the French Revolution, but nothing I took really seriously. So for me, it didn't even cross my mind that any of what I was remembering through these flashbacks could be real, and as in a real phenomenon, and also something that had been documented and relatively explained by scientists. So this fear of mental health was something that plagued me very heavily. And so this big flashback that I told you happened in May of 2016. And by July, the work that I was doing was getting close to its end. The company that had sent me was thinking about withdrawing their investment, which meant I would have to go back to France. And I think a few weeks before I did, I had this strange, chance encounter with a documentary from a French journalist who happens to be a former war reporter, who had decided, after he witnessed the death of his brother, to investigate extraordinary claims related to the survival of consciousness with a very, very scientific and let's say very precise eye, to make sure that what he was covering was serious. And I had no idea what I was watching. I just pressed play, and very quickly I heard of the case of James Leininger, which I'm sure most of you are familiar. For those who aren't, James Leininger was a young boy who was experiencing nightmares and vivid memories of his previous life as a fighter pilot in the Navy, who died near Iwo Jima in 1945. And for some reason, that documentary lit a spark in me, but not for the reasons you might think, not because he had vivid memories, which now I recognize I also had, but because he was describing his very violent nightmares, which for some reason I never really had an explanation for them. My brother and my sister didn't. And it always struck me why I would have nightmares about such violent things where I wasn't exposed to imagery or any real event that would have affected me in this way. But all of a sudden, I finally heard that some people were going through the experience of remembering the life of somebody else, and especially in my case, somebody who died violently. Even though I have to be clear with that, at this time in the story, I had no memory whatsoever of how I died, of who I might have been. All I could have was context. And as these memories, these flashbacks started to pile up in my life, at the time I was back in France. I was try to soothe my soul. I was living back in my home region, and I was working the most peaceful life I could find. So I became a receptionist in a castle, which was wonderful because life is very predictable and comfortable. But that didn't really work because now I had this constellation of flashbacks that were happening to me, sometimes repeating. So I was experiencing twice the same scene over the course of a few weeks. Sometimes they were entirely new and they would never come back. But I was well versed enough in history to know that I was starting to see the perspective of World War II from the perspective of what I thought was an officer. Why an officer? Because A, I never saw myself fighting. I was never even barely holding a weapon, or if I did, I wasn't firing it. What I did was planning, logistics, deployment of troops, sometimes strange flashbacks about having to solve the nightmarish issue of having our dentist missing. So no more dentist in my unit. And for some reason, that's a flashback I had. And somebody fighting in Russia, which I knew extremely little about at the time because being born in France, you are taught about the Western theater of operations and nothing about what happened in the East, which is where most of the fighting took place in the Second World War, at least in Europe. So I came back to France and I started to, lose my mind slowly because all of a sudden these flashbacks went from once in a while to daily. And I already talked about the visual aspect, which in my case was very strong, but I think the emotional aspect is often overlooked, which is you feel where you are, you know what's going on, you feel the danger, or you feel the pressure, or you feel what I like to describe as the weight of command, of the weight of having to make decisions on the spot that have to be extremely precise, otherwise consequences can be very dire. This is something that used to weigh very heavily on me in my current lifetime because they were omnipresent in those flashbacks. A year passed. It was now, if I remember correctly, July of 2017. So I had been back for about a year. And I had to find a way to make it stop, either through validation or through dismissal. So I tried to reach out to some therapists. Obviously, I knew nothing about reincarnation, and the very little amount that I found online, especially in French language, was very underwhelming, to say the least, because I was only accessing some very skeptical point of view, which was interesting because they kept mentioning it as either New Age beliefs, which I was not really a fan of, or things that is believed in some Eastern philosophies such as Buddhism, but not really validated by any kind of science. So for me, there was nothing to look for in that way. But one day I found that some therapists actually focus or have a specialty in dealing with people who have past life related issues. And one day I reached out to one of them. So here I take my car, I drive to the west of Paris, so an hour drive, because there are few of them, so I had to drive quite far. And I go see this wonderful lady that just listens to me for an hour and just tells me, you're not the only one who goes through these kind of things. Some people are plagued by past life memories, sometimes unconsciously, sometimes consciously, as it was in my case. And then she mentioned past life regression to me, which I had obviously never heard about. I was familiar with hypnosis because I had done a hypnosis session to stop smoking, and something very interesting happened during that session. My therapist made me remember the very first time I smoked a cigarette, and I knew then that I was very receptive to that kind of altered state of consciousness, I would say. And this is how it started for me. We had a few sessions. We went over the goals were of this session and what I should expect. And for me, I hoped, well, at least I hope that in that case, I get to perform the final step in my healing journey, even though I didn't think of it this way at the time. And so I could put it aside and move on with my life, because now it had been over a year since this experience was dominating my life and was stopping me from any kind of meaningful step in the right direction for my future. Comes that day, 8th of November 2017, around 9 a.m. I walk into the office. It was raining outside. And to be closer to the therapist office, I had spent the night at my sister's place. And the night before, something extremely strange happened. I told you that I had never had any flashback of firing any kind of gun. But that night, as I go to bed, riddled with anxiety about what's going to happen the next day, all of a sudden I have a very, very violent flashback that lasts about a second. I see myself clearly holding a rifle. I press the trigger, and in front of me there is a man, his back turned to me, smaller, and I shoot him in the back of the head, and he falls down. And I see another officer just laughing. End of the flashback. Obviously, you can imagine my state of mind when I went to see my therapist the next day. But we go on with the session. She walks me through this process of slowly getting lower and lower and lower. She makes me visualize several doors, but I don't really need to be encouraged, because one of these doors is open, and without me realizing it, in that meditation, here I am. I'm no longer in a room. I am outside in a light forest. I can feel that it's a summer day because I'm not wearing too many clothes. And I can feel that it's my last day. For some reason, I know that I'm going to die that day. And all of a sudden, I'm aware of the situation. I'm angry. And I'm angry for a very specific reason. I'm aware that I was ordered to stop my unit in facing east. And not from a fault of my own. Something happened outside of my control, and to remedy to that situation, I had to stop my advance. Obviously, we were attacking, and now I have to hold the defensive ground, and I'm aware that there is nothing around me to anchor my defense. I'm aware that there is nothing around me that would allow me to have any kind of protection against a large-scale attack. And I'm aware for the first time that who I'm facing. In front of me, I have Russian soldiers. And even though I knew nothing about the war on the Eastern Front, all of a sudden I'm aware of their weaknesses. I'm aware that if I'm moving, I'm relatively safe, because they can't coordinate an attack as well as we do. So if we're moving, we will only encounter small units here and there. If we stop, they can probe, they can coordinate, and they can launch a large-scale attack against us. This terror moves to something very different, because all of a sudden I'm not outside, I'm in a tank. And something very brutal happened, because the tank got hit by something very, very violently, and I can feel myself being thrown forward. There was an explosion in the tank. I know it because all of a sudden I've lost hearing. I'm deaf from the explosion. There is some kind of fog or haze in the tank from the explosion that just happened inside. I myself am not injured beyond losing my hearing, but I can see that one of my crew members on the front right has been hit by a projectile somewhere around the shoulder. And I mean, I don't want to be too graphic, but I can see he has an awful injury. Obviously, died instantly. And my first thought is we need to reply, because our tank has just stopped, so we need to reply. We need to fight back. Our tank is armed. We could. And I turned over to somebody I know instantly is my loader. So the man who's supposed to put ammunition in the gun, he's on my right immediately, very close to me, less than a meter. And I realize that he's just paralyzed with fear. He's yelling. I can see him. He has his hands next to his head. He's yelling. And I try to encourage him, but nothing comes out of my throat as well. I'm paralyzed by the shock as well. And then I'm hit by a realization. I'm going to die right now, because there is nothing that can stop the gunner from firing a second time. We're immobilized. We're still in his line of sight. And that thought just throws my mind into a whirlwind. All of a sudden, I have these a million thoughts all together that come, images one after the other, of the last step I took, of the thought that I'm going to be the first to die today, which is a very strange thought to have, because you always imagine yourself to be the last one standing, and all of a sudden you realize I'm the first who's going to fall in that attack. And all these thoughts just come and collide with me until they stop. And there is this very eerie silence in my mind that anytime soon it's going to stop. And there's this peace, peace is a big word. Let's say quietness of the mind, that it's over. And then it does happen. I'm very, very faintly aware of some form of explosion, a vibration, nothing more, on the right-hand side. And no pain, no nothing. I'm instantly thrown into a completely different perspective. I'm no longer inside my tank. I am now hovering about probably 10 to 15 meters away from my tank on the front right corner. And I noticed something unusual. I'm way too far above the ground to be standing there. Like it's not a natural position, but that doesn't alarm me. Instead, I'm fully focused on what I'm seeing. I'm seeing my tank slightly burning from the opening that was blown open by the projectile. I'm aware of a man that pops out of the hatch and just rolls on the side. I see it very clearly. And then it hits me. I've just died. I've just died, and the first thought that comes to mind is I want to go back in. I want to lead my men. I don't want this to be over. But it is over, and now comes a strange journey of a few days that I will get to experience during that regression. There is one very important moment that happens a few moments after that. It's hard for me to put a time scale, but I would say maximum half an hour after I died, obviously. I'm seeing in the distance, and this is a very strange perspective, because at first I'm far away. I'm probably 100 meters, but strangely enough, distances don't matter. I'm instantly aware that there is a younger soldier who's being talked to by a couple of officers, which are older, and there is this very somber air in the discussion. There is these two officers telling this man that I just died, and I'm here. I'm seeing this exchange from very close now, and I'm trying to tell this young man that I'm still here, that I can still hear him, but nothing works. There's nothing going through, and that's when it hits me that I've departed. Like there's this now broken connection being made where he can no longer hear me and reach me, and there's just total despair from then on. I remember from that regression that I followed my men for what I think is a few days, 1 or 2, 3, 4 maybe, and I'm following them throughout the offensive that obviously hasn't stopped, and until a very large battle happens, and I know it's going to be a massacre before it even happens. And then the perspective of the regression completely changed. I have to say, by the way, to give you all some perspective, that I received very, very little prompting from my therapist at the time. I was just going on and on and on, and the scenes were progressing by themselves. Sometimes she would even ask me to move on to a different perspective, while in what I'm seeing, I've already moved on to that perspective already 30 seconds ago. So it was a very intuitive process, this regression that I underwent, because now I was seeing all the scenes of my life that I had never seen flashbacks. For instance, all of a sudden I'm seeing very meaningful scenes. For instance, the first time I saw my father in uniform as an officer. And now I'm seeing the scene so clearly that I can see my medals. I can see that on my left collar I have a black square with three aligned white dots. And I'm seeing my father, and I can describe him very clearly. He's living in this stone house in a cobbled street, and he's waiting for me at the door, and he sees me coming, and I see him bald. He has these round like brass glasses, and he has this mustache that I had seen him so often twirl, but right now when he's seeing me, he's completely silent, and he has this grave air on his face. He finally sees his son in uniform, and this scene was very meaningful to me when I saw it in a regression. And so on and on and on the regression went. I would see myself in a lot of different settings, especially my ranks that I saw had evolved. All of a sudden, I was no longer wearing this black square with 3 tabs. The black square now had 4 tabs in each corner, forming a square. And I went on to experience a lot of meaningful moments of whichever life I was seeing in first perspective, as if it was me, until it was time to end the session. And I left this first regression thing very confused about the scene. I did feel some kind of relief that finally I had seen what was hiding in the shadows, because the perspective of that regression felt like I was seeing everything in HD compared to the very short flashbacks that I had before. And I thought, well, now I know this is what I was plagued with, because I remember, actually, my father is in the call. I'm glad he's listening to that. The first person I called after this regression was my father. My father was an officer in the French army, and I had never mentioned any of this experience to him before, but then I called him and I told him everything I had experienced, and he was the first one to say it. He was very perplexed, probably because I was describing all of a sudden very clearly the interior of the tank. I was describing a lot of duties that an officer would have, which are very different from what you would see in cinema. And he said, I think those insignias that you were seeing, they are SS ranks. And I searched online, and he was right. The ranks I had been seeing were the ranks of Hauptsturmführer, which would be in the US equivalent captain. Later on, the rank of Sturmbannführer, which in the US equivalent would be major. And I wanted to leave it at that. Every step of my journey up until that point, I really, really hoped that it would be the last one, because for me it was a very disturbing experience from start to finish, something that was depriving me of any kind of peace of mind, because the experience itself was violent, and also because on top of that, going through such an experience makes you question, as I said, your own sanity, which is something I don't even wish on my worst enemy. Doubting yourself 24 hours a day is the worst kind of prison, because you can't escape it. But here I had seen through this regression a very detailed account, and something that all of a sudden felt very real and very plausible, because there was no strange scenes that would make you think, hey, this is the stuff of fantasies, like some wild charge or wild heroism. There was no such thing. There was just the daily grinding of a very long war, and that regression gave me the perspective of somebody that was very eager to fight for his country at first, but as the days and the weeks and the months and the years went by, left to be replaced by this very deep sense of exhaustion and the feeling that this would never end, or if it did, surely me and all the others around would be long dead before this war had any kind of meaningful ending. So I left it at that, and I went to sleep, and I swore to myself not to do any more step in terms of research or anything, because I really felt like this was as much as I could take. So that was the 8th of November. Of course, that wish didn't really last very long, because the very next day, 9th of November 2017, I wake up, I have my breakfast, and I decided to, because I was worried of forgetting most of what happened in that regression, which was silly because it was recorded and I still have the recording. So everything I said was engraved on that recording. But I decided to start drawing, some details I saw, like for instance, the insignias I rank. Also, I remember seeing some medals. I had like a red ribbon on my sternum. I remember seeing, for some reason, my belt buckle that I also drew. I remember drawing the cap I was wearing. And all of a sudden, I have this urge, as I'm writing down these details, I have this urge saying, from the depth of my soul, I have enough information, I need to search. And so I go on my computer, and I don't even remember what I typed, but something about how I died, these two shots from the right while I'm in my tank. I think I started with that, and extremely quickly I fell onto a very obscure, the scan page of a very obscure history book that was talking about the one specific detachment of one SS division that fought in the Battle of Kursk in 1943, a battle I knew very, very little about. And all of a sudden I read those lines. The 8th of July 1943 was a dark day for the regiment, whose commander, Sturmbannführer Eugen Kunstmann, died when his command tank was hit by two anti-tank rounds. A very simple sentence, 27 words. But for some reason, just seeing the name Eugen Kunstmann and reading it with my own eyes sent me into a whirlwind. An absolute whirlwind of just impossible to explain. I type his name and something doesn't line up. He's registered, because I found a short biography in Polish. God knows how I found that. But it said, yes, true, Eugen Kunstmann, the man in question, died in 1943. He was leading his regiment at the time. But something doesn't line up because the ranks don't match what I was seeing, because he was recorded as being a Standartenführer, which would be the equivalent of colonel. So it's too high. It's 2 ranks upwards from what I remembered. And the rank looked like nothing like I had. So I thought there's got to be a mistake here somewhere. And I read this page in Polish. Polish has some similarities. It's with German, which I speak, and I see. But actually, this progression was this promotion was post-mortem, which means he died carrying the rank of Sturmbannführer that I remember wearing in my regression. And here I went, all of a sudden I had this name, and on I went into this very, very long process of trying to look at the details, trying to understand who this man was. And I think now it's time to show you, because very quickly I found a picture of this Eugen Kunstmann, and let me show it to you. I will share my screen. So, I find, looking for Eugen Kunstmann, I found this picture. Eugen Kunstmann in the man here on the right. The man on the left is one of the commanders of his tank platoons. And that picture was taken 3 months before Eugen died, while he was taking part in the offensive that surrounded the entire theater of Stalingrad. So Eugen Kunstmann was not in Stalingrad, but he fought in the counterattack against the counterattack of the Russians. And so this is how it went for me. Now I had a name, and I had some information that he died the same way I remembered, and on went a very long process of verification, not because I wanted to, but because for me, the perspective was this mental health it was about, because this regression had finally allowed me to start believing that there could be an explanation to why I was going through this strange story. Maybe there was a small possibility that there was something more than just mental health and me losing my mind. Maybe I was going through something that was just very rare, something I knew nothing about, but worth investigating. So I decided from then on to take it very slowly and verify step by step what I remembered, not making everything up, record, look through the data, and only base myself on rigorous sources. So this is how I actually reached out to a historian, because I had bought his book, and his book was the highest quality one I could find. And I mean, this was for me the start of a very long journey. Something funny happened during my research because at this time I was mostly gathering a lot of information. I had verified a lot of funny things, small details that started to, I mean, made me believe that there was a high possibility that whoever memories it was that I was having, probably it belonged to that man, this Eugen Kunstmann, that at the time I could not avoid but describing as I. It was me who had been going through these things, because this is what I had inside my heart. On the 8th, around the beginning of December, I met my therapist, my second therapist, for reasons I will not detail. I had started to reach out to a different therapist. Actually, I will tell you why. Do you remember the journalist that made the documentary that first put me on the path of past life memories? His name was Stefan Alix. Well, Stefan Alix, as it happened, as I was going through my story, had just published a book called When I Was Someone Else. And he was describing in that book the experience of going through past life memories of his own, being a Waffen-SS soldier who served in the same division as Eugen Kunstmann. So I went to see a conference of his on the 27th of November of that year. So I met the journalist, and that's when I found out that he had actually created a foundation in France aimed at studying these extraordinary experiences, not just reincarnation, not just past life memories, let's say on a broader scope, the survival of consciousness. And this is when I also discovered that through this foundation, he was also giving a lot of resources. That one of these resources was the ability to contact psychologists, because the first therapist that I went to see, how amazing, I mean, she was great, but she was not a psychologist. And because I was starting to feel like there was more than just exploring the past life memories, but I also wanted somebody who could deal with my current mental state, I decided to try to see somebody who was more versed, and actually that I could be reimbursed from seeing, because they would be a legitimate registered psychologist. And this foundation gave me a list of therapists, and this is how I got in touch with an amazing man who was a clinical psychologist who also happened to have gone through this experience of having past life memories of his own. And he was a very instrumental man in my journey. He steered me towards something he called, pardon my French, because in French we would say travail de désidentification, disidentification work, we would say in French. Realizing that these memories are yours and they are nobody else, but at the same time taking a distance, because this is also exactly what I wanted. I wanted to take a step back from all this nightmare. For the record, I want to say that this man that opened the door towards liberation for me had the past life memories of being a Jewish child who was shot by an SS soldier when he was younger. So that's how powerful sometimes connections can be. But that's how I went through my second regression, and that's also how I experienced something very deep, which is I finally felt the humane side, because that second regression was very different in the way that it gave me a perspective of a man that was, his experience in war was not linear. While the first regression and my earlier flashbacks were extremely powerful in terms of the emotional aspect, they probably never really opened any door for me for healing in the way that I found it hard to not relate, but there was such a difference between him, Eugen Kunstmann at the time, and me today. There was just two very radically different beings. But then all of a sudden, in that second regression, he made me experience a scene where I was in the snow and there was no fighting. And I felt, all of a sudden, I felt like what it was to be human in that war, feeling doubt, feeling like this will never end, and feeling like this entire enterprise of fighting in the East was just doomed from the start and should have never happened, and that this is not where I should be. Finally a crack, finally a weakness that I could remember. And that allowed me to identify fully to that, to whoever I was before, because by then I realized this is a past, this is my past I'm carrying on my shoulders, and for some reason it happened to me. I wasn't looking for it, but now I had to deal with it, and now I could finally relate, him, me before and me now. We're both humans, and we're both complex beings with complex stories, and that's how I started the work of really understanding Eugen Kunstmann as a person. The interesting thing that happened to me was probably 2 weeks after that, I was looking for information about Eugen Kunstmann. And if you ever done some research about Nazi Germany, you will be surprised to find that there are some very active forums of historians and amateur historians alike who together dive into the deepest, tiniest details of Nazi Germany's war experience. As it happens, Eugen Kunstmann was serving in a very famous division, which was the 3rd SS division, Totenkopf, which wasn't considered an elite division. And therefore, I was surprised to find that there was information about Eugen Kunstmann that was being discussed online. And I was browsing through this thread, scrolling down until I found a very interesting message that says, I am the grandson of Eugen Kunstmann, and I would like to have more information about my grandfather, especially how he died, because the information about his death is extremely scarce. And even though, I really hoped that every step was the last, well, I didn't even hesitate. I immediately started writing him a very long email where I say, look, I need to tell you that I'm a serious person. I'm not a lunatic, but I've been going through a very strange experience, and let me give you all the details. Some I could verify about Eugen's military past, which I will get on further down in this talk, and also the things I couldn't verify. And he replied to me very, very quickly. I think in the span of maybe 30 minutes, even though the message he posted on that forum was 8 years old, and therefore the email address he gave was probably not going to work. But anyway, he replied extremely quickly, and he said, your message came at the perfect time, because I was just with my father, who was the oldest son of Eugen Kunstmann, and we both read your message and something struck us. And that detail was, you remember when I told you in that regression, when I saw this young man being told about me dying earlier. Well, something I didn't say before is that I remembered that young guy's name. I remembered that his name was Georg. Even though I had no idea what my name was in regression, this man that was being told about my passing, I knew from the bottom of my soul that his name was Georg. While the Kunstmann family told me something interesting. Eugen Kunstmann had a younger brother named Georg who served in the same division. Georg survived the war and told the following tale to the family, which is basically what I was describing, that Eugen died on the front, he was killed in his tank instantly, and he was told about his brother's passing very, very quickly because he was there. Maybe not on visual range, but he was in the vicinity, close enough that I would be aware of his presence very quickly. And from then on, we started a very interesting talk. Very strange conversation together that lasted for weeks and weeks. Actually, to this day, we're still in touch, where I was able to give them some information about some of the things that I could remember that I could verify, some of the things that I could remember that I couldn't verify, and some of the things I remembered that nobody else knew. For instance, I remembered through my memories that my father had been some kind of shopkeeper or somebody who worked by himself. So they had to dig into their personal archives, and they realized that Eugen Kunstmann was actually the son of a toy shop owner. And so together we started to gather documents, go on this hunt to trace back documents, find some obscure information about their life. And this is also when they started to share more pictures with me, which I will share now. There it is. All right. Let me share those pictures with you. All right, so this is the one I showed you earlier. Well, that's a blurry picture, I'm sure you will all agree. But all of a sudden, the family was giving me this. On the left, you see Eugen Kunstmann before the war, just graduated. We estimate the picture to be from 1938. And on the right, this is Eugen probably a year before he died in 1942. And notice something on his collar. Do you remember what I saw in my regression? This black square on the left collar. Well, there it is. That was the one I remembered seeing in my regression. The one I couldn't see was the SS tab on the right, something I didn't remember in my regression, but for some reason, if I had remembered, it would have made things easier. But the SS aspect was completely absent from all my memories up until the moment I stumbled upon his military records. But something I said about making Eugen human is that beyond the soldier, I started to realize who he was as a person. He got married in 1941. He was apparently a very romantic man. He was so romantic that this is excerpt from newspapers that the Kunstmann family sent me. When Eugen died, his wife published the following messages on newspapers. My lovely man, the father of Uwe, which is the man I was now in contact with, passed away. And this is essentially the message posted by his wife. And a sadder message, 3 months after Eugen died, his wife published a second message in newspapers saying, my second son was just born, bearing the name Eugen. So I was now, now all of a sudden Eugen was a real person and not just somebody I saw through blurry photographs or odd mentions in some history books. I was seeing pictures of Eugen as a child, as you can see on the left, or enjoying his leisure as a regular young man. Who would have known that several years later he would just be fighting the most brutal conflict we've ever seen in Europe? Through this prospect of research, I also found some pictures sent me by the Kunstmann family. For instance, you remember what I mentioned, seeing in my regression, meeting Eugen, my father, and how he was a bald man with his round spectacles and his mustache. Well, here is a ID picture of Eugen's father that we found, which is a dead match, this round head and the round glasses and the mustache. Well, something I found, which is the entire family was affiliated with the Nazi party. Everybody joined. Eugen just happened to be smart enough to become an officer later during his training. When I received some pictures, it also triggered some memories, which is, I'm sure, so those of you who are familiar with the research know that this is something that happens. Your memories get triggered. Well, in my case, something happened. The family sent me those pictures of Eugen on the left and Georg on the right, two brothers together. And on the right, another picture, the name Emil, something I just could not remember. Well, it so happens that when I saw this picture, I instantly knew that Emil, my younger brother, died at some point, and I was aware of it, that he died when I was still alive. And this is something that took me a while to verify, actually, but I realized that Emil Kunstmann died in November 1942, fighting 1941, during the Barbarossa operation. So when the Nazi Germany started to invade the Soviet Union, Emil passed away and his body was never recovered. So this is something that weighted heavily on Eugen's conscience. I also started to find, for some reason, some pictures of all the operations. The reason why I'm showing this picture, so Eugen is in the center, he's wearing the light colored jacket. The picture struck me because it looks a lot like the images I had of the very, very first flashback I had. This is a picture that was taken, was Eugen was fighting in the Battle of Kharkov, which was in March 1943. After the Battle of Stalingrad, the SS was sent to counterattack, and they were extremely successful, leading up to the city of Kharkov, which was a bloodbath for the Soviet army, because it was only the Waffen-SS was deployed in that area, and they waged a brutal battle, which culminated in about 15% of the population of the city being slaughtered in the course of a few weeks. I also found some pictures of Eugen in his command tank, the one I remember dying in. There it is. Well, I know it's a command tank because it has extra radios, and the man perched atop his tank is the tank commander Eugen Kunstmann. So this was taken probably a few months before he died. It's very faint, but you can see on the front left corner of the tank here that I'm highlighting, there is actually the Totenkopf, which is the death head symbol of the division. I also found some extremely rare documents. This one is worthy because this is the last known picture of Eugen Kunstmann. It was taken, we estimate, 2 hours before he died. So this was taken the 8th of July, 1943. But this is, obviously, I mean, I had now in front of me the depth of the human soul. I was but at that time I was remembering an extremely wide array of elements of Eugen's life, a lot of them which I could verify. But there was still something missing, and I was still plagued by that. And actually, my story took a very radical turn one night, which proved to be really annoying for me because I had just started a new job 3 days ago. But one night I was hit by wave after wave after wave of flashback of a very different nature, because now I wasn't remembering what happened when I was alive. I was remembering what happened in what I now call the intermission period, the life between lives. So I told you already that I remembered being this soldier disincarnate who was, this officer that was following his men on the battlefield. But what was happening now was that I was remembering being a man that was witnessing not just his men, but I think those of you who are familiar with the theory of what happens after you die, the way I experienced it was there was a dissolution of my sense of identity, because I went from being very aware and very close to what was happening to the point where the way I would describe it is I was following my men. So very much still an officer perspective. But after a few days, I remember watching this nightmarish battle where all of a sudden nothing makes sense anymore. You don't have a normal front line like you will see in a normal clash. You have fighting happening everywhere all at once. There is so many destroyed vehicles that the smoke from the fires rise in a very peculiar way. It rises up, and when it reaches a certain altitude, it makes this kind of weird scening of smoke that turns the entire battlefield into a very dark and nightmarish place. You have tanks fighting so close together, they're ramming each other, or they're fighting each other at point blank range everywhere, no more front line. And then I realized that I'm not alone in that point of view. There are other men, some which are German, some which are Russian, and we're all together watching the carnage. There is no more sense of distinction between us. We are all one watching the carnage, and we all know we're powerless. We're just there waiting for the new arrivals, allow me to speak this way, but we were just waiting for the next ones to die. And something that I remember from those flashbacks, seeing something strange, is that I could see those who had just died, and it was just a pitiful sight, because I would see those men like struggling with their diseased body. For instance, somebody trying to gather pieces of his body, even though he's no longer there. He's now a ghost, just like we all are. And my thought was, he doesn't know yet that he has died. So for some of them, the shock of death was so violent that it took a while for them to realize it. And I was starting to fully embrace my new reality, that now there was nothing more for me. And the last thing I remember witnessing from the battlefield was when the battle was over and the sun had set, The last living things I remember seeing were the stragglers. Something for some reason I had never really considered before, but after a battle of this magnitude, you have a lot of people who've been separated from the units, and they were just holed up somewhere waiting for the night to fall so that they could rejoin their lines. And I remember the very vivid realization that these men still had something to fight for, whereas for me, I was now disconnected from everything. And seeing those stragglers was the last thing I remember from the reality on the ground. From now on, the perspective in the afterlife turned very different. I don't remember going anywhere, which is actually why I named the book Fields of Prokhorovka, because I remember staying on this field of battle and just not going anywhere for a very, very long time. This endless night slowly evolved to a very introspective journey in a never-ending prison, which is you try to escape this place, but you realize that the further away you go, you just always come back to the same point of desolation. Nothing changed, so there is nothing worth going to. And all of a sudden, the people talk about life review. I don't remember experiencing it this way. The way I experienced it was slightly different. It was like over a very, very long period, I was just revisiting scene after scene after scene after scene after scene. Always the same perspective, but there was always something slightly changing, because after you've seen something long enough, and that perspective in this review was quite powerful, because you're aware of everything. You can feel what the others are feeling. You can your point of view is more than just yourself, and it's the best teacher, really, because there is no hiding from the truth, from what really happened, from what you really did. And you can hide yourself behind all the lies that you want, but when you're confronted with that perspective, you can't really change. You can't really lie to yourself anymore. You have to confront yourself to what really happened, to what you really did, what you really thought, what you were really seeking through the things you did. And the central element, I think, to highlight this experience of the disincarnate state in those endless fields, I think it's best to tell you something that I experienced during regression, which was, and also just the flashback just before, which was shooting somebody in the head. When all of a sudden, in regression, I had a much larger perspective of the event. I remember that we had captured a young boy, probably 14, 15. In that day and age, you were considered an adult on the front line. We had called this partisan, and I was aware of the word partisan for some reason. I knew that's how we were calling him. An irregular, somebody that we had caught with explosives, and I don't think I was there when he was captured, but I was told that he was captured laying explosive in some supply route that we were using, waiting to blow up some cars that were going to pass by. Very quickly, the interrogation I led proved to be meaningless, because what he was willing to tell us we already knew or could infer. So the next step was for him to die, because in that day, for men like us, when you captured somebody without a uniform, waging war behind the lines, it was instant death when you were captured. Once you had outlived your usefulness as an informant, it was time to put you to death. And what I remember is ordering him to dig his own grave, and we passed him his shovel, and after a few moments, when I realized he wasn't going anywhere, he was sobbing, so we decided to call it quits. The shallow grave was now ready. We bound his hands behind his back, and he started to weep until he didn't, and I armed the rifle, I aimed our fire, and he fell. He fell in a grotesque way, kneeling on the ground, so one of my men kicked him hard, so he would lay down, and we didn't even bother covering the grave. We just left him where he was, and I felt nothing. For me, it was just not an everyday thing, but it was not something that bothered me at all, not at all. But from the perspective of the disincarnate state, that scene I've revisited a million times, always learning something new, realizing why he was there. For some reason, I remember seeing probably where he grew up, some house made of logs in the Ukrainian countryside. I remember the entire process of him being called upon to defend his homeland. And of course you would. Everybody would in that situation. And so he became an irregular, too young to join the actual army. So he was now a courier, and then he became an explosive layer, and then he was caught, and then he died. And I remember having this very deep exploration of my mindset, and that was probably the best teacher to realizing the mechanism of hate. How you go to having a man like Eugen, who was the son of a toy shop owner in Germany, goes from there to being a ruthless enforcer of the Nazis' policy against the occupied territories in the Soviet Union. I learned that hate is something that is learned. You are taught how to hate. You are taught how to ignore your deepest human feelings, which is something is very wrong when the innocent dies. It taught me how similar we were in a way, him and I, doing what we thought was right, when in reality we're both just, puppets, in a way you could say, just playing out a script that had been written a long time ago by people way more powerful than him and I. And revisiting this scene a million times also made me realize that the more it went, the more the frontier between him and me started to blur, because by now I had experienced the execution of his perspective so often that I was familiar with every twitch of his muscles, as if I was him, you know. And this exploration in the fields lasted for, what felt like a million years, to be honest. It felt like it was never going to end. And the funny thing, the consequence is that when you're in a place like that, purging yourself from all the lies you've been told, all the lies you told yourself, and all the horrors you witnessed and perpetrated, and something worth noting, I felt no different whatsoever between witnessing something and not doing anything about it, and doing it yourself. The perspective is exactly the same when you are in this review phase of the intermission memories. And by then, the perspective had changed. I had become still. I had become comfortable is not the right word, but I had embraced the never-ending nature of those fields where I was now, where it was just always dark, and the sun never rises, and that was just my nature. I was just there. There was nothing ever changing. Until something changed and somebody came to get me. I don't know how to describe her, so I will describe her the same way I do in my book, The Lady. There was this lady that entered my universe, and she was just so much more noble and shining a strange light that some of you probably will know what I'm talking about. Extremely bright, but doesn't blind you. When she talks to you, she speaks a language that doesn't need words. And she came to get me, and she made me realize that the time had come. And I don't know what happened between the being on the fields and my next memory, but now here I was in those strange fields where, in a strange space that felt like she had created it. She had created this strange cloudy environment that felt both huge and small, shining with a strange bluish light that didn't feel cold, and these strange words. I'm not a native English speaker, so bear with me, but finding words to describe this space is extremely complicated. But it felt like there was more dimension within dimensions, as in you look at the volutes of the clouds that you're standing on, and it feels like the more you look, the more intricate they become, and that they add an extra depth to them. Anyway, she wasn't alone. There was two seemingly male beings behind her that never said anything to me, but they were just there to let me know that they were there to witness what was going to happen. But the lady let me know that the time had come for me to move on to something different, and I wanted nothing to do with it. The idea of coming back was just too much to bear, because I had grown accustomed to the only sense of peace that I knew, which was in the stillness of the fields where nothing happens. Because then and there I knew that I could do no wrong anymore. I had fully reconnected to my nature, which was this sensitive, benevolent aspect of being human that we all are deep inside. I'm a true believer of that. And I had forgotten through the ebbs and flows of growing up in 1909, being born in 1909 in Germany and going through the depression and going through the chaos of the 1920s and seeing in Hitler and the Nazi Party a way out of all your troubles, and then deciding that the best way to forge that future is to become the hammer that will forge the future of the next generations. All those lies had disappeared. And she felt my unwillingness to come back, let's say, and she didn't really try to convince me. Instead, she did something that, to this day still floors me. She didn't try to argue. Instead, what she did is she had this strange wave of the arm, and it's like she opened, again, I don't know how to say it, an extra dimension on the floor, because by looking down, I could experience scenes, and she just, they happened so quickly that I couldn't really let them warm me long enough. I could barely make a sense of them, but I could feel what they were about. And up until the moment she took me to see a scene, and both my parents are in this call, this is going to be a really funny one. I was taken to a scene in some strange lobby and large restaurant, and there was some tables in the back, some long tables, and I remember the I think the carpet was blue, and the table had this white and red cloth, and there was these two people sitting together, a man and a woman, and the woman had a child on her. She was playing with a child on her lap. And I remember watching them both and hearing that the man had a thought that said, I would have children with that woman, being very aware of that. And then it struck me that what she was saying was this lady was showing me the parents she was recommending, and strangely enough, she didn't even ask for my permission, because I feel that when she felt this agreement inside of me, she very, very slightly pushed me, and I felt myself falling down. And the next thing I know is the feeling of like falling backwards into a pool of frigid water. It seizes you. All of a sudden, every cell in your body is sending you this electricity of sensations. This is how it felt like. And all of a sudden, I'm in a room and everything's blurry, and I see this strange triangular shape in front of me where somebody is wearing it looked like a Christmas tree, like a dark green. And the room has two colors. The bottom part of the wall was white, and the top one was this faint light green. And there was this strange light on the top right corner, this horizontal light. Well, the funny thing is, when I told this to my parents a few weeks or months after, they were a bit surprised, because it seems that I was describing the scene where they met in 1987, and bear in mind, I was born in 1991. And also, my father is in agreement when I say that he thinks that the place I'm describing after I fall into this frigid water is actually the room I was born in. And I went to see it in Paris. It's no longer a clinic, but I saw from the outside the room where I was born, and there is this window, because the room is kind of underground, and they had this window just to let the natural light in the corner. And apparently the room had these colors, and the doctor that gave birth to me actually was wearing this dark green apron so it wouldn't get dirty. So, it was a strange experience, because having these memories of the intermission made me realize the process of how you, deep inside, we're all humans, and when you go through such an extreme experience of being an officer in Nazi Germany, especially in the SS, especially on the Eastern Front, you still have this humanity inside of you that's just buried very deep inside, and maybe it does take a long time, but at the end of the day, redeem is not the word, but you are purged of the lies and the horrors, and you are granted a way to become a force to pushed the universe slightly in the other direction. That's something I felt strongly after remembering that. And so that's how I went. I went on a journey of healing, which also made me extremely critical. I've something I want to say. I say that every time I talk about my story. In no way should anything I say about Nazi Germany be constructed as a way to diminish the horrors of what was done under its name, or the responsibility of those who performed or did atrocities under its name. They shouldn't. However, I think this experience made me realize that reality is much more complex than what we agree. The mechanisms of hate, first of all, they are not unique to Nazi Germany. They've been used before. They are being used after. They are being used to this day. And but it gave me hope in the way that these teachings in teaching hate, teaching how to hate, teaching how to view the others as different, they are not natural. They are taught. You need to construct the structure of hate into somebody so that they can hate somebody before even meeting them, because that's not human nature. So I mean, this was obviously a very deep experience for me, and